From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. The Hayman fire burned through a huge swath of forest southwest of Denver in 2002. It left behind a massive burn scar. Workers quickly replanted thousands of trees to reestablish the forest. But more than 2 decades later, large areas of the Hayman burn scar still resemble a moonscape with some scraggly young trees here and there.
What's coming back now is an amazing amount of wildflowers and grasses. And it's the trees, though, that we're worried about whether or not they're going to come back.
That's Stevens-Rumann. She's the assistant director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University. And she's been studying reforestation efforts after a wildfire. Because burn scars that take decades to heal are becoming a fact of life throughout the West. It's partly due to climate change, which is shifting which types of trees will grow naturally in mountain forests. In a recent Scripps News story, Camille argues it's time for a new approach to how we replant forests after a wildfire. So we wanted to know what she thinks Colorado's forests should look like in the future, and why trees that have historically thrived in Colorado's mountains don't grow back quickly in a burn area.
Our view of these forests is very short. It's our lifetime, and these are really long and slow-growing species. So in some cases, a lot of our trees established 100, 200, 300 years ago when the climate was actually very different than it is today. And so while they can survive in these changing climate conditions because they have deep roots and they're really tall and have gotten used to these changes through time, it's a lot harder for that new seed, that new tree to establish and start growing because they're the most susceptible when they're really tiny.
You know, aside from the fires, how has the climate changed in Colorado's forests?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of places in Colorado being really impacted by drought and hotter temperatures. We've been in a kind of continual drought in some way or another for the last over 20 years. And that really is impacting our trees on a very fast rate if you're talking about those new trees, those baby trees establishing, but also on a kind of slow and continued stress on our older, mature trees.
So you proposed a solution that might seem a bit radical to those in forest conservation. You're talking about replacing a burned forest by planting the new trees slightly uphill, basically about 300 feet higher in elevation than the previous forest. What do you hope that accomplishes?
Well, I think we're in this period of really rapid climate change, and we're often really limited with how many trees we can actually plant out there. This is a huge human resource and financial resources needed to even plant one tree, right? We have to collect the seeds,
Sure.
We need to grow them in a greenhouse, and then we outplant them. And we want that to be successful. We don't want to spend all of this effort planting trees that die.
Yeah.
But we know that the climate is changing. If we plant them in the exact same place they were before, there's often a higher likelihood that they're not going to survive. But if we move them uphill in elevation, they seem to have a little bit better survival rates.
And then just so I'm sure I understand, why does it help to plant trees about 300 feet higher?
Yeah, so the Forest Service mandates that we get seeds from the same area or same elevation as we're planning on planting. And our National Forest System checks to make sure these trees are surviving or see if they are. And what we've seen is that you even if you move them up a little bit, like 300 feet, they tend to do better or are more likely to survive and grow better. And that is probably because of the more suitable climate, right? It's slightly cooler, potentially a little bit wetter at higher elevations.
Sure.
And so they have, just slightly buffered conditions.
And then what do you recommend planting in the lower areas of a burn scar, kind of where you don't recommend replacing those burned trees?
Well, I think this is a human value. If we really want forests there, then we need to be thinking about what can survive. And in some of those lower elevation areas, the solution might be that we need to just accept that they're not going to be forests again. Another possibility is choosing trees that come from either lower latitudes or, are found in different areas, like think northern New Mexico or northern Mexico, might be more similar to what our climate is moving to.
You mentioned planting different species of trees that will thrive in hotter, drier conditions, basically non-native species for this area, which to me sounds potentially problematic. Tell us why you recommend this.
Well, I think this again comes back to our human value. If we want or need a forest to be there, I think the other thing about moving trees around that's not as true for some of the other species movements we've done that have resulted in really bad things, like cheatgrass is
Right.
one that people know a lot about, is that they're slow growing, right? And they're pretty unlikely to spread and get out of control and be, invasive in that way that we use that term.
I'm curious, Camille, what do your colleagues think about this plan?
I think it's mixed. There's a lot of people who I think are thinking the same thing and testing this out and experimenting with it, much like we are. But I think there's also a lot who would say we need to be keeping, the genetics as they are on the landscape. And for us to manipulate these, even moving the same species just to a slightly different location than those seeds are from, has potential negative effects. I don't have the right answer, but I am worried about if we really want to have these forests where they were before, whether or not we're willing to accept them just not being there.
Well, your organization, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, is testing these ideas now by planting in some areas of the Cameron Peak burn scar. How is the experiment going so far?
Yeah, it's going really well. We have planted, across the full elevational range within the Cameron Peak fire in a very controlled experiment. So we're not letting any trees go run wild. But we have seen a lot more survival in the kind of higher elevations. And so a species like ponderosa pine, which is one of the ones that we see on the lower Front Range, is actually surviving at 9 or 10,000 feet in elevation. And that's one of the things we didn't really know before. We know a lot about how trees are drought or heat tolerant, but we don't often check of what their cold tolerance or snow tolerance is. And that's what we need to be thinking about if we're moving them up the mountain.
Huh.
That's been really cool to see how well some of the trees are doing even at really high elevations.
Well, let's talk longer term here. If we keep replanting in burn scars the way that we have been, what will Colorado's forests look like a few decades from now?
I think my fear is if we keep planting the way we have, we are going to be putting a lot of resources out in the forest for a lot of dead seedlings. And I think that that's where we need to get to with a lot of our forest plans, is thinking more proactively about where these trees will survive so we can use those resources wisely.
And then just to kind of flip that around, how do you think they would look in 50 years if we planted the trees at higher elevations and used some different species as you would recommend?
Hopefully a forest. I mean, I think that's ultimately all of our goal, right? Will it look like it did when it burned even 50 years from now? No, but hopefully it will be a thriving, productive forest.
Camille Stevens-Rumann is with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at CSU. You can read more in our show notes and at KUNC.org. That's it for us today on In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thank you so much for listening.